it was he who said, if we don't do something about the brain, we're going to become a race of morons, on the 5th of November in 1972. And the lion's only got about 350 grams of brain. The dolphin has 1,700 grams. So a very clear signal that the availability of DHA pre-formed in the dolphin's food was what enabled it to make this huge brain that the dolphin has.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sara, and today I have a very special guest. It's Professor Michael Crawford, who's published over 300 scientific papers, 3 books, and also written many co-authored book chapters. And his area of expertise is the brain, lipids, and health. His current work focuses on the rise in brain disorders and mental health, as well as neurodevelopment problems. A bit more on his background. In 1989, he founded the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition as the research arm of his charity, the Mother and Child Foundation. Professor Crawford's also won numerous awards. Just to list a few is the International Prize for Modern Nutrition in 1995, a gold medal for science and peace by the Albert Schweitzer International University in Germany, a gold medal from the government of Oman, and an Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese government. He's also been elected to the Hall of Fame of the Royal Society of Medicine, and that was in 2010. So I'll hand you over now to the man himself. Welcome to the channel, Dr. Crawford. Do you want to tell everybody how long you've been working on DHA and what it is and why it's so important?
Well, we first published on the significance of docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, in 1971, and I've been working on it ever since. But what we realized in the early 70s was that it didn't matter whether you studied an elephant's brain, a rhinoceros's brain, a monkey's brain, or a human brain, or a dolphin's brain. They were all the same composition. So the actual composition of the brain, in terms of its fatty acids, was highly conserved. What was different between the different species was the extent to which the brain had evolved. And that could easily be traced by looking at the biology of the different species to 2 things. So, firstly, in metabolic efficiency, that all the little animals had very high metabolic efficiencies and could convert the parent fatty acid, linolenic acid, alpha-linolenic acid, into DHA. This occurs in green foods. So it's present in grass, it's present in lettuce, it's present in cabbage, and all those sort of things that are green, associated with photosynthesis. So it's particularly rich in the marine system, which starts off with phytoplankton and algae and things of that nature. And so the small animals could, with high metabolic rates, could easily convert to the parent essential fatty acid in the omega-3 series, that's alpha-linolenic acid, could convert that to DHA. But as the body size, the velocity of acquiring body size accelerated as you got bigger and bigger mammals. So the ability to make DHA, which was falls off. And so you find that in a rhinoceros, you have a huge head, but a tiny brain that weighs no more than 300 grams. And this is achieved, the rhinoceros achieves a 1-ton body weight in 4 years after birth. And that's the velocity of protein deposition and protein acquisition. It gets all the protein it needs in the world from the simplest food, namely grass. But what it can't do is to make DHA to have a decent sized brain. And so we discovered all this in the 1970s. But let me add to that of course the contrast to the land-based mammals were the marine mammals. if you take the dolphin, for argument's sake, it's about the same body size, body weight as an animal like a zebra or a lion, if you want to have a carnivorous comparison. And a lion's only got about 350 grams of brain. The dolphin has 1,700 grams. So a very clear signal that the availability of DHA pre-formed in the dolphin's food was what enabled it to make this huge brain that the dolphin has.
Yeah, that's a very important subject, because I was going to ask you about the origin of humans and why seafood has been so important in our evolution. But I think when you just compared the lion to the dolphin, the diet is going to be an important part.
Yes.
And then maybe when you go into it, if you could tell people why DHA is so important at the biochemical level, and then we'll go into the quantum properties of DHA a bit later.
Well, DHA, in all our studies, and not just us, but anybody who studied lipid biology and the brain and published on this, universally have identified DHA associated with the signaling systems of the brain and vision in particular. The rod outer segment of the photoreceptor in the eyes of all animals is very rich in DHA. And we suspect this goes back to the beginning of animal evolution, where this would be about 600 million years ago, when oxygen tension started to rise. Living systems originated in the planet about 3.5 billion years ago. And for the first practically 3 billion years, there was no real movement. It was all anaerobic. There was no oxygen. But as time went by, the anaerobic life systems excreted oxygen, and oxygen was released by photolysis of water and so on. And eventually, enough oxygen came into the environment to enable air-breathing animals to evolve. And when that happened, there was what was called the Cambrian explosion, in which all 32 phyla that we know, animal phyla, almost come into the fossil record overnight. Not quite overnight, but you know what I mean. However, at that time, there had to be a chemical which started off photoreception. And we've got things like the dinoflagellate, which has got an eye spot, which can both see and photosynthesize. So it's like the sort of transition from the early systems which were anaerobic and the new systems which became aerobic. And this little thing it's a single cell system, and it contains a lot of docosahexaenoic acid, contains a lot of DHA, and most interestingly, it contains a molecule in the membranes which contain two DHA molecules. It's a di-DHA phospholipid. And the interesting thing about that is that you have in your photoreceptor, we all have enough photoreceptors, di-DHA as part of the signaling system, the receptor system that's involved, enabling us to see. So it's very likely that the dinoflagellate was or something very similar to the dinoflagellates, initiated the beginnings of vision and the beginnings of the nervous system. Because what we suspect happened was that the DHA absorbs light in the ultraviolet. And in the transition from anaerobic to aerobic, there was no ozone layer. The planet was bathed in intense solar ultraviolet radiation. DHA absorbs in the ultraviolet. So it's very likely that DHA was the original chromophore that absorbs ultraviolet light, and that would have powered one of its electrons. That's the way of the absorption of light. You know, we have it today in our solar panels, but the same thing would have happened with DHA, and the release of electrons would have initiated the evolution of the nervous system and then ultimately the brain. So that's the sort of timeline we think happened. And the evolution of the nervous system was quite rapid, and the brain comes into the fish, and they were very early in the game of air-breathing life. So we think that the DHA really kick-started the whole business of the nervous system and the brain.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that photoreception, it makes it possible for DHA to convert photons into direct current in the body,
Yeah,
like you alluded to. But just to go a bit more into the biochemistry, there's the SN1, SN2, and SN3 configurations of DHA, and not all of them have the same properties, do they?
no. The cell membrane has got two layers sticking together. It's a fatty acid in the middle, which is water insoluble, of course. And then you have the water-soluble section of the phospholipids, the phosphorus and the choline and all that. So these head groups stick in the water, and the fatty acids stick in the middle of the membrane. So you have an impermeable membrane that doesn't allow water to get through, other than through special pores and things like that. So that's the structure of the membrane. Now, in those phospholipids, you have, first of all, the head group, which is phosphorus and choline, at one SN3 position. And then you have in the middle, SN2 is called, because there are three positions that are available. You have the highly unsaturated fatty acids. All unsaturated fatty acids go into the middle position, the SN2. And then in the SN1, you have a saturated fat. Usually stearic acid is commonly found in the SN1 position. So predominantly, docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, sits in the middle, in the SN2 position. But in di-DHA, it sits in both SN2 and SN1. So you have an extraordinary situation where you have two molecules of DHA sitting together, and the chemistry that we've studied of this system, the physical chemistry, shows that the three of these molecules can be planar. That is, they can make a nice structure. And so you can get sort of almost a crystalline kind of structure in the membrane with DHA, and especially with where you have di-DHA. And this contributes to its ability to act electrically.
Do you mean it acts like a semiconductor?
Yes, exactly so. I mean, this is not widely considered, but DHA has 6 double bonds. Carbons joined normally by 1 double bond, but in DHA, in a double bond, you have 2 links between the carbons. And this produces a bunch of electrons that are quite far out, called pi electrons, going round the 2 carbons. And these are very exciting electrons because they can be energized by solar radiation or anything, and pop out and pop back again. But and in retinol, which is the actual chromophore, the thing that receives a photon of light, you have an 11 cis that the double bond can exist in a kind of U shape like that, which is cis, or it can do a chair shape, which is
Trans.
The chair shape is trans. There are 2 different positions, but in the 11th cis position is the one that's important in retinol, because that absorbs the photon. But the double bonds in retinol are what we call conjugated. There's double bonds, double bonds, double bonds. There's nothing in between them. So these pi electrons can overlap, and so it can work like a copper wire. Electrons can run up and down the molecule. Any conjugated system of double bonds can transfer electrons. But in DHA, we have something very different, because in between the double bonds, there's a methyl group, and the methyl group presents a barrier to the movement of electrons. So effectively, DHA is a resistor. But here comes the rub. If you actually extract an electron from DHA, all you need is a potential difference strong enough to do the extraction, and that's not particularly difficult. If you extract an electron from one of the double bonds, that leaves a hole, a positive hole. Now, in classical physics, people think of these barriers, these methyl groups in between the double bonds as barriers. But in quantum mechanics, you don't have barriers. You don't have barriers at all. All you have is a probability that an electron will be in a certain place. And Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner, who won his Nobel Prize for work on electrons, he said, you've got to think of electrons as being anywhere. They can go anywhere. And so what you've got to think of is that an electron in one double bond could move across as a waveform, because electrons can exist in both particles and as a wave. And if you think of a barrier as a physical thing, then you think of the particle not being able to get through. But as a wave, you're not quite sure where it starts or ends, and that can sort of get through anything. And so the electron as a waveform can go through this barrier, so to speak. Now, if it finds that the next set of pi electrons around the DHA is full, that'll be all negative, and it'll be rejected. It'll go back. But if you take an electron out, there'll be a positive hole. It can jump into that hole. And this is a process whereby electrons can actually move in what is called a process of tunneling through these barriers. And it was been well described in proteins and various other places. But this can happen in DHA, and we've published on this. And you can get the electrons to tunnel through DHA, but only when the potential difference across the membrane reaches a certain point. So that's the definition of a semiconductor. That to begin with, it's a resistor, but as the potential difference across the membrane increases, then an electron can be pulled out and it can conduct. Now, the beauty of this, the absolutely supreme beauty of this, is that when the electron moves into the hole, it can only move into the hole if it has exactly the same quantum mechanical properties of the electron that was pulled out. If it's a different type of electron, different spin, for argument's sake, you have positive or negative spins, then it will be rejected. It won't fit. So what this means is that when DHA conducts electrons, it's conducting the electrons at this energy level and the energy properties of the electron that was removed. So you only can have electrons with that property moving through the molecule and moving through whatever happened. So in effect, although it's a semiconductor, it's actually defining the properties, the quantum mechanical properties of the electrons that are going to move. Now, this means absolute precision of the signal. This means that the signal is absolutely precise. It's precise at the energy of the electron that's been removed. And this is not explained. The precision of signaling is not really explained in any other way than quantum mechanical properties of this nature. And so this is really one of the beauties of DHA, that it can actually conduct electrons but it can only do so at one energy level, giving absolute precision to the signal, which the brain needs. I mean, the brain can't have signals that are all over the place. If the brain wants signals that are precise, and this is the only explanation for the precision of the signal.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and thank you for explaining that, because I think people are familiar with electrons tunneling in the electron transport chain in the mitochondria.
Yeah.
But the description you've given is excellent, because we're full of electrons, and it's like, how do they know where they're supposed to go? And like you said, if we just had random communication in the body, it would create chaos, which is terrible in terms of quantum physics. So I think the importance of DHA in the brain, that really made sense to me. So I just wanted to just move into your book here, which I'm reading. The Shrinking Brain.
Yeah.
There's a quote, and I've heard you say it before, that in 1972 you said, if we don't do something about the DHA or the mental health crisis, we're going to be a race of morons by 2024. So do you want to now go into why there's the DHA crisis and problem? Because it's multiple, from people choosing not to eat seafood, people thinking seafood's got contamination in it, not understanding DHA, taking supplements, or all sorts of different things. So maybe you want to talk a bit more about that statement. I think I've got the actual wording not quite right, but I think the point is gets across. And I shouldn't really say moron, because it might offend people, but it's actually sometimes you've got to say that to make people take interest.
Yeah. I don't see why it should offend people. I mean, the race of morons was not my quote, although it was actually Graham Rose who reviewed a book that we wrote, my wife and I wrote, coming back from Africa, having spent a number of years in Africa. I was there between 60 and 65 at Makerere, teaching at Makerere Medical School and also doing research and stuff. And I was taught by Africa the importance of nutrition. Anyway, when we came back to England, having done our job, because our job was to help build the new medical school's hospital, or get it going and working and things like that, and our job was really to do that and have people take over from us. We weren't there for the long term, and came back to London, and were horrified at what people were eating by comparison with what we ate in Kampala, Uganda, and various other places in Africa. And so we wrote this book, What We Eat Today, in which we said that we have the clear evidence of the rise in mortality from cardiovascular disease to #1 killer is linked to adverse nutrition. We have clear evidence about that, and particularly with regard to the fats. In those days, the fats were considered very important. And so what we wrote was to say that nobody's paying any attention to the brain. There are no recommendations about what people should eat with regard to brain health or anything like that. It's all to do with protein. People want to have big bodies, and protein makes big bodies. As I give you the example of the rhinoceros, a ton in 4 years of body growth from simply grass. Anyway, so the point we made was that unless people pay attention to the brain, then brain disorders are going to be the next big thing after heart disease. And Graham Rose reviewed this in the Sunday Times on the 5th of November in 1972. And he said, it was he who said, if we don't do something about the brain, we're going to become a race of morons. Not me.
Okay.
he actually puts the quote in as though I had actually said it, but we had if you read the book What We Eat Today, there's not a whisper of morons in the book, but nonetheless it's a very vivid point that he made, and it's what's happened, because no government, and this is why we wrote The Shrinking Brain. No government has made any recommendations with regard to the health of the brain. It's all about protein. And protein is not to do with the brain. Protein's to do with the body. And you've now got, you fly into the airport in Houston, and you have craning your neck to look at these small people, all full of protein. And it's people who, anybody over 6 foot used to be considered a giant when I was growing up, but now people over 6 foot are quite common. And so the protein business is really done us a disservice. We need to start thinking about the special requirements for the brain, which are the requirements for the brain and the requirements for the body are totally different ball games. And the requirements for the brain are mostly these lipids or essential fats that are needed for its signaling system and myelination and all the rest of it.
Because in your book, there's also the graph showing the decline in IQ, and it's actually only from the 1950s. So it's quite alarming. And there's evidence for this decline in our cognitive abilities. So do you want to maybe talk a bit more about DHA, but not just that, but also the fact that seafood contains minerals, and the minerals are really important at a quantum level in the body. And I think manganese for protecting DHA, and iodine, of course, has quantum properties, not just thyroid properties. So maybe to give us an overview of what you think is important for the brain in terms of nutrition.
Right. Well, the first thing, of course, is DHA. It is this molecule which is at the center of all signaling systems, the synapses, the neurons, and the photoreceptor. And it's also important in the auditory route. It must be important, although not described, will be important in all sensory routes into the brain. Now, DHA is difficult to actually put together in very simple words, but let me try. DHA is the center of the signaling systems in the photoreceptor and the neurons and synapses. This we know. Now, if you don't get enough DHA, and people have done experiments on this in animals, and you lose visual acuity, you lose cognitive ability, you lose learning ability, and it affects the hippocampus. This has all been shown quite extensively, that the deficiency of DHA, which is usually caused by, in experimental animals, by a deficiency of alpha-linolenic acid, so they can't make it in little rats and things like that. And in school children as well, there have been studies that have been done on the same thing. And particularly, this became of interest in feeding formulas to infants that weren't being breastfed. And way back in the 70s, said, well, you've got to put DHA into these formula. And the industry didn't want to know about it at the time. They said, we put linoleic acid in, that's all we need. That's the only essential fatty acid. But that was not true. I mean, we studied, and Tom Brennan, a lot of people have studied the composition of human milk across the world. And it's always consistently the same, that you have both DHA and another fatty acid, arachidonic acid, which is used for a different purpose in the brain, but it's still important. You have almost the same composition in human milk across the planet. So nature is saying, it's important to feed the infant with both arachidonic acid and DHA. But it took an awfully long time for the formula industry to actually come to terms with this. And they had to the people like Susan Carlson, Bob Gibson, and Maria Macready's, and Stuart in Aberdeen, and so on. A whole lot of people, and particularly the bunch down at the Retina Foundation in Dallas, they all demonstrated that if you left DHA out of the formula of preterm infants, then the visual acuity dropped. So this is evidence of the same sort of thing that we see in animals, in humans. So there's absolutely no question about the evidence of the significance to human brain development is robust and unassailable. But nobody's doing anything about it. There's no government that has made any kind of recommendation. The only thing we've got is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, saying that you mustn't eat too much fish because it's got mercury, and mercury is neurotoxic. Well, mercury is neurotoxic at very high levels, but not at the levels that are in fish. It's extraordinary. They never thought about the Japanese. The Japanese ladies have been eating fish and seafood practically every day of the week.
And every meal. They eat every meal as well.
Yeah. And they gave birth to the children that have grown up to have the best longevity and the least major depression of any industrialized nation. The FDA didn't even think about that. I mean, it's ridiculous. But the point really is that we've Phil Spiller, who was a member of the FDA, has got up in arms about it and has written with a lot of us several papers showing the benefits of DHA, all the studies, putting all the studies together of how DHA is important in pregnancy, the pregnancy outcome. So the problem here is that because the FDA has said you should only eat 2 fish a week or something like that at the most because of neurotoxicity. A lot of women have said, whoa, there's mercury in fish and it's neurotoxic. I'm not going to eat any of that during the pregnancy. And this will have had a terrible effect population-wise in terms of denying the newborn child of the full genetic potential for intelligence and vision that his genetic heritage would have given to him or her. So it's really worrying, this FDA thing. And there is another issue about DHA in the brain, and fish and seafood in particular. And that is that DHA is highly susceptible to peroxidation. That means the molecule can be broken up by free radical oxygen. Now, the brain uses more oxygen than any other tissue in the body. It's 2% of the body weight, but it uses 20% of the total energy level of an adult. And in the fetus and newborn baby, it's higher than 60% when the brain is growing. So energy consumption by the brain, it requires oxygen, of course. And requiring oxygen raises the stakes of peroxidation and brain damage. So come Nicholas Bazan in Louisiana, and he finds that DHA actually, funnily enough, makes a thing called what he calls neuroprotectin 1, which is a molecule an oxidative product of DHA, which actually protects DHA against peroxidation. But also there is this huge number of what we call them antioxidant proteins, things like manganese superoxide dismutase and so on. These are built with trace elements, manganese, zinc, copper, iron, all involved in proteins that in the brain specifically protect DHA. They are distributed in the membrane and they're distributed in the cytosol inside the cell. So they're covering the whole of the cell to protect it against this very high rate of oxygen use by the brain. So these trace elements become particularly important as well as DHA because they're going to support the defense systems of the brain and enabling it to use this huge quantity of oxygen which it uses without burning DHA up. And the point being, of course, that if you take something like a fish and seafood, it's also rich in all these different trace elements, selenium, zinc, manganese, copper, and oysters in particular are wonderful for this sort of thing. Oysters and at the expensive end and at the cheap end, mussels. But don't forget that oysters were once commonly eaten. In 1900, the barman at the East End of London used to go down to the Thames and fill the buckets with oysters and put them on the bar free for people to have if they bought beer. And the Museum of London has a notice saying oysters free with your beer from 1900.
Nowadays, you get a free burger or chips with your beer. So that's kind of really interesting to know about. Because just backtracking onto the seafood, so would you say things like we can buy razor clams, scallops, what else? Yes. And we'd say those are the shellfish. What about the larger fish? Because with DHA, because it's heat labile, cooking is going to degrade a little bit, but we don't cook fish very much, as in the pan. But what about tinned fish? Has all the DHA been destroyed in the tinned fish?
No.
Oh, that's okay.
There's some very loose remarks about all of this, but a tin of sardines is a very good source.
Oh, that's good.
And that's not expensive either. So you can get tins of mackerel as well. They're quite rich in DHA. And they also, as it happens, contain quite a bit of the trace elements too. All fish and seafood are rich in the trace elements, but the seafoods, the clams and shell stuff that we talked about, they're particularly rich in the trace elements. Iodine, don't forget, iodine also goes along with that bunch, and we're seeing iodine deficiency creeping back into the school children in the UK.
How does iodine deficiency manifest? Thyroids aside, what else does it do that's really important, or does it all revolve around the thyroid? Because I think iodine, can it stabilize proton wires in the body? Maybe just elaborate on iodine a bit, because that's an interesting element.
Well, an iodine deficiency is the commonest cause of mental retardation, and it's that's really very simple. I mean, I had the pleasure of being invited by the Indonesian government in 1900 to come to help their Ministry of Health to sort out problems. They had a health plan that went 5 years for 25 years, what they were going to do. And in the health plan, solving problems of anemia in pregnancy, vitamin A deficiency in the eye, and particularly cretinism. There was something like 1 million severely mentally retarded children and 800,000 cretins in the main islands of childhood. And this they thought was affecting really the population with cretinism. So we did a big survey, and it was all these numbers came out, and we had a big meeting, and I made the point at the meeting that you can always forget about the numbers because 60% of the school children have palpable goiter. That's the thyroid grows and grows and grows when iodine is deficient, trying to extract iodine out of the blood. And so you get big swellings on the neck here with this swollen thyroid. And 60% of the children had detectable swelling of the thyroid in the school children. But the point I made was there were none in the fishing villages, none in the fishing villages. So what Darwin Kayati and I did was to persuade the government that what they ought to be doing would be to develop kelp, farm kelp, because kelp is a seaweed in a sense, and very rich in iodine. And you can use it as food, you can use it as fertilizer, and you can use it to feed your animals as well. And in all instances, it's going to put iodine back in the soil, and it's going to put iodine into the food system. And they now have, on the island of Bali, a massive great region where families have a plot, like a field and a farm in Norfolk or something like that. And this is a plot in which they grow this kelp. And they're growing the kelp on a massive scale. The kelp farmers are now making more money than the inland farmers. And they're sorting the iodine deficiency out across New Zealand as well. So that's an interesting lesson.
That's important because I know lamb, you can get DHA from lamb. So if you fed sheep on kelp, would you get a high DHA or high? I know seafood's the ultimate choice, but if you feed the kelp to, say, cows and sheep, are you going to get more DHA in animals? And then people who don't like fish can eat the animals.
Yeah, it's a tricky question because ruminants gain their energy by sort of bacterial growth in the final stomach. And the bacteria use highly unsaturated fatty acids as deposits of hydrogen. Normal metabolic processes for energy involve using oxygen. Oxygen combines with two atoms of hydrogen and makes water. Now, they can't do that because they don't have any oxygen inside their stomachs. So what they do is they use the highly unsaturated fatty acids. They dump the hydrogen into the unsaturated fatty acids because there's no oxygen to dump it in, to make water with. And that means that a lot of the unsaturated fatty acids that these animals eat is hydrogenated and effectively destroyed. So any ruminant animal is not going to have much in the way of DHA. But there are, funnily enough, you mentioned sheep. There are these sheep, I can't remember which island in Scotland, where the farmers built a wall around the island to stop the sheep from invading their crops and things like that. And the sheep are eating the seaweed. And we analyzed the liver of these sheep, and there was much more DHA, without question, much more in the liver lipids than we would normally expect to see in lamb and cows and things like that. So, but I don't think that any ruminant animal is a good source. What used to be a good source were chickens, of course, and chicken eggs. Eggs are, there has to be DHA in the egg, otherwise the chicken's not going to be able to make a brain. I mean, we did studies on this quite a long time ago. Pierre Podolsky from the Hobbit in Israel. And it's quite clear that the DHA, they make DHA from the green food that they eat, and the animals that eat green food that they also eat when they're wandering around in the field. But unfortunately, since the 1950s, there's been this great surge to intensify chicken farming. And with it, there has been a complete collapse of the amount of DHA in chicken meat and chicken liver.
Because we used to keep chickens, and even though they ate things outside, because they need to eat the worms and stuff, people still feed them grains and chicken feed, and it's almost impossible to get chicken feed without antibiotics. So even if a farm maybe advertises the chickens as free range, are you saying that if the chickens have been eating chicken feed and grain, the amount of DHA in the egg is going to be significantly less than it would have been when before the 1950s?
Yes, I think that's the case. I mean, during the war, we were all, anybody who had a garden, and a lot of people had gardens in those days, were told to dig it up, and we were told to have chickens as well. And the chickens were in the garden, and they had no well, they had the garden fence, but they had free range of the garden. And as you say, they ate all this stuff. And a lot of the snails and slugs and worms and things that they ate had also eaten green food. So they were eating the precursor for DHA all the time. And their tissue was significantly rich in DHA. We actually, funny enough, we did a study for the Royal College of Physicians in the early 1970s, when Jerry Shaper was chairman of a group that were writing a report on diet and heart disease, and he asked us to measure the levels of these fatty acids and all sorts of different things for his report. And in chickens, there was 170 milligrams of DHA per 100 grams of meat, fresh meat. Now, this was in the 1970s. In 2000, the year 2000, we were going to. There was a meeting that we were attending, and one of my staff wanted to give a paper. So I said, "Well, why don't you analyze some chickens?" Because we analyzed them in 1970 to see what's happened with all this intensification since the early period. And Dr. Wang analyzed the chickens and found that the highest level he could get at was 25 milligrams. This is down from 170. And so we published this, and it was Hugh Whittingstall invited me to go to his place to look at free-range chickens and intensified chicken. And I was horrified at what I saw in the intensified chicken factory. But the point you made about the free range is interesting, because Hugh took me to a free-range farm. And of course, there were a whole lot of chickens inside the house where they had a pannier of this corn feed. And there were quite a few of them on the outside. And he called them the exploring chickens. And he says he had noticed in himself that in his own chickens that there were some that wanted to run around outside exploring and doing things, and others that just wanted to stay inside and eat the food that was provided for them. So the free range thing is a bit questionable. It's not questionable. It's the right thing to do. But the trouble is that most of the free range farmers provide huge quantities of food which doesn't contain any of the green stuff. So they don't get the alpha-linolenic acid parent for DHA. So they can't make DHA. And so the levels in the free-range chickens that we analyzed, although better than than the intensified ones, they were nowhere near as good as they were in the 1970s, where they were almost properly free range with very little in the way of animal feeds provided for them.
What with other poultry, what about something like a goose that won't, you can't battery geese because they just die? Would a goose egg yolk be a good source of DHA?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And then
yes.
what about something sort of like a pheasant? Because we can buy pheasant and goose meat, but then I've never seen pheasant eggs. And then maybe duck and duck egg. Would that be a better option? But does it
Well,
fundamentally come back down to what the ducks ate?
yes, certainly the eggs and people in the wilderness who gather seagulls' eggs and things like that. And perhaps during our evolution we would have gathered seagulls' eggs as well as eating fish and seafood. And also, I have no problem with people during the evolution of the brain using land-based products. I think our evolution was the thing that powered the evolution of the brain was wild food, and what the wild food came from both land and sea. And we had the best of both worlds that powered our brain. And the food that we eat today bears little resemblance to that. Yeah.
Also, what about eating bone marrow and brain? Because brain is a source of DHA, and you can buy pig brains in the UK. I mean, other countries it's regulated. I mean, and you can buy other animal brains elsewhere. But would a brain or bone marrow be an option for getting DHA but also in terms of what our ancestors did? Because it's almost impossible to crack a buffalo's skull, isn't it, to get the brain out? But smaller animals, maybe.
Yes, but don't forget there will be so little of it. The brain would obviously be rich in DHA, but if we're talking about tropical Africa, where the thing wouldn't last very long, whereas a chunk of meat would last. You'd be able to kill an animal out in the bush and carry the meat back, but you probably wouldn't be able to carry the brain back. It would dissolve in the heat of tropical Africa. But on the other hand, you see, the women so highly pregnant will be able to walk along the coastline and just gather for very little energy a wealth of rich food, both in terms of trace elements, in terms of DHA, in terms of even protein as well. It would have been so those coastlines would have been just so rich, and so easily gathered, so easily gathered.
So if we move away from, we've done birds, we've done fish, and we've done ruminant animals, what about something like nuts? Do macadamia nuts contain DHA?
I don't know, to be honest with you, I don't know about macadamia nuts. I've never analysed them, but walnuts are a good sort.
All right, and do they actually have DHA? Not
No. They have alpha-linolenic acid, which is the precursor.
Oh yeah, but then a lot of it, we're not very good at converting that to DHA, and it varies genetically from person to person. So would you say that nuts, it's the same as, say, if I ate kelp or seaweed, is there any DHA in that? Or again, do I have to convert it? Or does the kelp actually have DHA already made that I could eat?
Well, there's so many, yes, the kelp does, yes. And there's so many different seaweeds that contain different fatty acid compositions, but most of them will contain either DHA or EPA or one of the precursors, the docosapentaenoic acid as well. So they're good sources of trace elements, in particular iodine. And of course, the Japanese eat a lot of seaweed, and so do the Koreans and a lot of other people like that.
But also, I'm half Welsh, and we eat lava bread still.
Oh, yes, of course you do.
Yes, so the Welsh eat seaweed.
Yes, they do.
Yes.
I don't know if it's anything to do with their good singing voices, but they
Oh no, I can't sing, but I agree with you. The Welsh do, because my other half is I'm a New Zealander, and I think your daughter lives in New Zealand, doesn't she?
That's correct. Yes.
Yes. So, but also in New Zealand and the UK, because they're both an island,
Yeah.
the potential for fish is huge. So maybe you want to talk a bit about fish farming, because there are problems, as we know, with collecting shellfish, especially certain beaches. But nowadays, would you say that fish that's been farmed properly is better than no fish at all, or maybe
Oh
just
yes. Oh
about?
yes, definitely,
There's so many
definitely.
different ways you can farm fish, because you can actually make the water really clean for the fish to live
Yeah.
in. And
Yeah.
then the fish farmers can choose what they feed the fish. And I think one of the problems is the water's clean, but they feed fish rubbishy fish pellets and spoil it all.
Yes. Yeah. Well, your last sentence is unfortunately what's happening now. It wasn't like that to begin with when they were able to use fish offal in abundance, but with the sort of the fish catch having reached a limit in the turn of the century, there's less and less fish available for uh, feeding farmed fish. It's sad actually, because they're now using vegetable oils and chicken feathers for protein, or chicken themselves, and this has led to a practically halving of the DHA content of the meat. So it's better than nothing, but they could do better. They could do better, and I think the real way to go forward, and as an island nation, is to do what the Japanese were doing. I was involved with the Japanese in 1990, and the government invited me to go and advise them about one thing and another, and the fact that they were concerned with the inroads of Americanization of food systems and so on. And they were concerned about the impact that was going to have on the intelligence and health of the Japanese children. So we ended up by discussing the idea that what we should be doing is to use the minister's words, agriculturalizing the oceans. And this is what the Japanese have been doing. They have, between two islands of Okayama, they have a huge area under what they call ranching. What they have been doing is they've been, the trawling for fish and things like that has created marine deserts. And where they had these muddy patches and marine deserts, they've been cleaning it all up, and they've been planting seagrass. So just as we have pastures for cows and sheep in land-based farming, so they have green pastures in the sea. It's elementary, and that's nothing difficult about it. And of course, this is wonderful, because it not only provides food for the herbivorous fish and other species, but it also provides hiding grounds for the new little born hatchlings, so that they can hide in amongst the grass rather than being eaten by the predators. And they've developed artificial reefs that they studied the breeding habits of 7 target species, and so they built artificial reefs to plant designed for each different species' behavior patterns, and planted them in the deeper waters. And these have been colonized by the marine flora. And it's not just a question of being colonized by the marine flora, but also, you see, they've designed them in the context of the behavior patterns of the different species. For example, there's one species that likes to hide in holes. So they have a huge artificial reef which they plant, which is just full of holes. And they plant it in the region where these particular species was breeding. And they've tripled fish catch in the region. And this is the way to go. And of course, they've got oyster rafts and so on and so forth. I mean, you can farm oysters, mussels, scallops, a lot. And you could develop crab farming, prevent lobster farming. It's all pretty elementary stuff. But with us as an island nation, my goodness, even with the Scottish, many of the Scottish islands are actually now depopulated and nobody's living in them. Mm-hmm. They could become the basis of what the Japanese are doing, and to amplify our production of fish and seafood and shellfish and so on and so forth. It could make us completely self-sufficient in food. There's no question about it.
And then we could sell our fish, we could export it and have an income.
Well, yes, I know, but the trouble with a lot of it.
Oh, yes, with exporting.
We're also selling, I mean, we once were up in Scotland and we were having a sort of camping holiday or something, and we went to the coast just to have a look around in the motor car. And there was a nice harbour in this village, and there was a ship, and it was just loaded with lobsters. And so I popped my head over the banister, and I said to the fellow, "Are you selling these by any chance?" He says, "Yes." And he said, "How many do you want?" And I said, "Well, we're about 3 or something like that." And I said, "How much are they?" "I'll give them to you for a £5." And so I said, "Where are they going?" "France." That's the trouble with this. A lot of the stuff that we are catching at the moment is being exported. In fact, if you look at the landing data in what was it, 2050 or thereabouts, we landed about 1 million tons of fish. In 2019, it was down to 600,000 tons. Now, as the population had grown by about a third, that means there was a 40% per capita reduction in the landing of fish. And we think this is behind the escalation of mental ill health and decline in IQ.
Can I just ask a question, going back to DHA and the biophysics? How much damage does artificial blue light do to retinol and DHA? Because you said that one of them, I know that they absorb in different wavelengths, but is the technology use and not and LEDs and not non-natural lighting contributing to the problem as well? That first of all, we don't have enough DHA to start with, and then secondly, because of technology and screen use, we're actually destroying the retinol and the DHA. So we've got two problems that are actually going to accelerate this decline.
Yeah, I have to confess I don't know much about this blue light story, but anything that destroys DHA in the retina is not good news. That's pretty obvious.
And then I think I wanted to ask you, it's something again about the quantum properties of DHA and whether it's paramagnetic or magnetic or not, as in you explained amazingly how the electrons know where to go from DHA, but is DHA itself paramagnetic? Because oxygen is, and then the blood's magnetic. So I was just curious, just to finish off on some more of the quantum properties of DHA.
Yes, it certainly is that, and we've done studies with nuclear magnetic resonance, which show that the double bonds respond to changes in magnetic field. So, and that's part of the evidence that it's going to be able to do this electron transfer business with tunnels. So yes.
So would that mean that also the non-native EMFs, the Wi-Fi, the phone masts, if there's the electromagnetic properties of DHA, would all of the technology add to this DHA problem even more?
I have a friend who believes that hook, line, and sinker, and takes great precautions to avoid being near these masts and things like that. I don't know what the evidence is. I've not actually studied it myself, but I wouldn't be surprised that what strong electromagnetic fields would have an influence. But I think this the whole thing is so well screened, and there's such a lot of absorbing material here, there, and everywhere that I'm not sure to how easy it is for radiations from phone masts to actually get at DHA and the photoreceptor or the synapse. But if it did, it depends very much on the frequency and the wavelength.
Oh yes, because it's huge. It's a whole other topic, and it's something that because you're an expert in quantum physics and DHA, I just wanted to ask your thoughts on it. But like you said, if it's something that's for another discussion or another day, we can always. Because just to finish off, maybe if you want to tell people a bit about your book, The Shrinking Brain, because I'll link it in the description so people can buy it, because I read it backwards because you told me to start with the and it's actually really well laid out to read, and it's very interesting. So for somebody who's really enjoyed this conversation, what joys are there in this book?
Well, there are two joys in the book. One is Darwin, and the other is DHA and arachidonic acid, interestingly, and perhaps attempts by various people to rubbish Sir David Attenborough when he chaired a meeting that presented the evidence, scientific evidence, and hard scientific evidence that we actually had an evolutionary experience that was coastal. That doesn't mean we weren't using land stuff, no, but the clear evidence, and so far as I'm concerned, that it's absolutely could not have evolved a large brain without access to the marine food web. Couldn't have done that without access to DHA and all these trace elements. So now, what's really your question about this? Because
because the thing is, I've already started reading the book because I'll just spoil it for people. The thing is, first of all, there are pictures and graphs, and it's very easy to read. And it's like you said, anything we've talked about in this interview, apart from the technology, it goes into more detail in the book. And there's also I think that this is with the references here. It's hugely well referenced. So I think how many pages are there? 200 pages of references. So everything that you've published here is sort of like your life's work, as well as a vast amount of literature review. And I just think it's really important for people to get hold of something like this, because you've basically put it all in one place for us to read, and you've made it simple for lay people to understand as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yes. Now let's get back to the book then.
Yeah.
There's these two big themes. One is Darwin, and the other is the brain, or evolution of the brain. Put it that way, because the evolutionary aspect is really terribly important. I like to think that if people know about how things happen, the mechanisms of how things happen, then they're much more able to accept new knowledge and put it into action than if they don't understand things. And so we've tried to explain the evolution of the brain, the evolution of Homo sapiens, and why this serving the interest of the nutrition of the brain is so important. But we start off with restoring Darwin. Darwin, in all 6 editions of his book, and this is fundamental because this is the environment, and the environment is the thread through the whole story. Darwin, in all 6 editions of this book on the origin, said that there were two forces in evolution: the conditions of existence and natural selection. And of the two, the former was the most powerful. the conditions of existence was the most powerful. And that's obvious. I mean, for example, the best example of this is, of course, the 3 billion years of aerobic life in the prokaryotes, doing not really very much. And then, boom, when enough oxygen is available, you have all 32 phyla forming. That couldn't happen until the conditions of existence were appropriate for oxygen-using life to evolve. So the idea that the conditions of existence is more powerful than natural selection.
Because that's what you're saying is that Darwin's theory is too slow. So because all of a sudden the oxygen appeared, if it was just natural selection, there wouldn't have been this explosion of the 32 phyla if it was purely natural selection. Is that what the crux of what you're saying?
That's roughly what Darwin was saying, not what we were saying.
Yeah.
Was that the conditions of existence actually determined what natural selection could do.
Right, okay.
It's as simple as that.
Okay, no, that's fine. I understand now, because there are some people that disagree with certain aspects of Darwinianism, but I'll let you just carry on because
yeah. Of course, the next bit is the fascinating bit. But Darwin is only associated with natural selection, not conditions of existence today. Why was that? It was because August Weismann, after Darwin's death, sometime after Darwin's death, considered this was too Lamarckian. So he did an experiment where he cut off the tails of mice. And he observed the fact that no tailless mice followed in the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation of cutting off tails. So he wrote a paper, a very important paper, called The All-Sufficiency of Natural Selection. The All-Sufficiency of Natural Selection. And this dumped all of Darwin's interest in the environment, one stroke. And I think at the time people were ready to accept this, that we were the world map was covered in red for the British Empire kind of stuff, and we were the greatest, and natural selection had to be the thing. Wow, we were it. And, the sort of self-aggrandizement was probably part of the acceptance. But this paper was absolute sheer rubbish. It was mutilation. It had nothing to do with the environmental conditions of existence. And he should have known this. I gave a lecture at the Whittington Hospital, and I said on this story once, and I was saying, that they should have known this, because the Welsh farmers, and you will know this, the Welsh farmers have been cutting the tails off sheep for centuries, and they still grew tails. And an elderly gentleman in the audience got up and said, Professor Crawford, with a name like Weismann, he should have known even better, because his people have been cutting the foreskins off newborn male babies for 3,000 years, and they still grew foreskins. So this is the level of the naivety of that paper, and the naivety of the population of thinkers of the day to accept it as gospel, and to dump Darwin's concept of the conditions of existence, which my co-author David Marsh considers to be a fundamental shift in public perception of the whole of biology, which is part and parcel of the way we have destroyed the planet today.
Yep, that'll leave people with something to think about. The problem is that's just triggered one more question in my mind, because you must have heard of our fellow countryman, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Oh, yes, very much.
The morphic field and the non-heritability problem. So just to add on to that, what are your thoughts on that, the morphic fields, and because that sort of ties in again to...
Well, can you be more specific, please?
Oh no, I think it was just because you mentioned Lamarckism and how we can inherit, because I suppose just very briefly with Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field, it's about how not everything is genetically inherited, and and shape and morphology can be transferred genetically. I was just curious
Yeah.
about what because I know he's published a lot, and I was just curious about your thoughts on morphic fields.
Well, this I think would be up to David Marsh, but me also. The fact of the matter is that uh, perception got a bit distorted with Watson and Crick and the sort of the Crick dogma that information flowed out from the DNA, but never back, never back.
Mm.
Now, of course, we know it does flow back. And it's called epigenetics. And as an epigenetic study of epigenetics is the study of the way in which an environment influences the expression of the gene, turns on one gene and turns off another gene. And this is fascinating because, in fact, if we think about the brain, for example, DHA incorporation into brain cells actually turns on a number of genes that are important for the maintenance of the brain itself, which is fascinating. And so this is yes, this in fact is Darwin's conditions of existence, that there is a feedback from the environmental conditions, the chemistry of the environment, through various receptors. DHA goes in through an RXR receptor that influences the way genetic information is expressed without changing the gene itself. So it's reversible. Now, the question that I've often asked is when you try to explain the evolution of the marine mammals, for example, one needs to wonder how did this all happen? How did land-based animals become marine mammals? This is quite extraordinary. And you have to ask, as we know that DHA, for example, is Joe Hilburn, who used to be at the National Institute of Health in America. He published a great deal showing that DHA is a happiness, and so maybe the happiness that drove them into the sea. But if you look at the flipper of the dolphin, it has all 5 fingers and the bones of the human arm inside the flipper.
Mm.
So the information of a hand and the bones of the arm is still all there, but they've just been covered up they've shrunk and been covered up by skin. So one wonders just to what extent epigenetics played a particularly strong role in the evolution of the marine mammals coming from land-based mammals. And today, it's pretty obvious that this is the environmental impact that is causing the brain to shrink. But this is all part of the environmental impact, and it's very worrying.
Oh no, I completely agree because genetics is a small fraction and the environment is the lion's share of the phenotype. I did do my degree was in genetics and biochemistry a long time ago, but it's one of those things I've kind of focused more on the environment in the way in which I can convey information to people because we can't change our genetics. And I think what you've talked about today and information in your book is an extremely good way for people to learn how to change their environments. And I think, like you just said about DHA, in some ways it's like a happy chemical as well, because without a good brain, we can't enjoy anything.
Well, there is one thing that I should have mentioned earlier, because an important issue was with regards to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and all this neurotoxicity nonsense. Joe Hibbon, who we've just mentioned, worked with people at the in Bristol University, and Jean Golding, colleagues, and on a study which was called the Avon Longitudinal Study of pregnancy, in which they gathered all the information of what happened during the pregnancy, and then followed the children up for 8 years of age. They actually followed them up beyond that, but the data that he published in the Lancet was at 8 years of age. And what they found and they had to, they tried to get rid of this fact by all these confounding factors. Were one by one, they could try, nothing would get rid of the fact that the cognitive performance, motor function, social and behavioral patterns of the children at 8 years of age was directly correlated with the amount of fish and seafood that the mother ate during the pregnancy. It was a straight line. And he published in the Lancet a graph to show that if you follow the FDA recommendation, you were in the group that produced the worst outcomes for cognitive mental health development.
So those are the people eating only 2 fish a week?
Less than 2 fish a week.
Less than 2 fish a week.
Yes.
Well, yes. Well, I think that's the problem. Carry on.
What he actually says in the Lancet paper, and this was a study of 14,000 pregnancies, so it was the biggest and longest study of its kind, and absolutely robust data. I mean, the statistics are beyond question. What he says is that fish and seafood idea of FDA, the restriction suggested by the, or not suggested, advised, it was an advisory of the FDA to restrict fish and seafood consumption during pregnancy would do harm. Those were his words, published in the Lancet, will do harm. Now, the first principle of any medical practitioner is to do no harm. It's one of the first principles. And there in black and white are these words, that this advisory will do harm. And this paid no attention.
That's the problem.
Another example of the lack of complete, I just don't understand.
Oh, it infuriates me. They cherry pick studies and publish and put those out in the media. There's so many that I know about where it's glaringly obvious, yet they'll just those in charge will just dismiss it and focus on a much weaker study that's epidemiological or whatever, and then say that's the truth. But there's nothing that you can do about it other than just bringing out sort of interviews like this, your book, and just re-educating people on what they should be eating. Because one thing I wanted to ask you just to end, because I know it's rude to ask women how old they are, but you're obviously extremely cognitively sharp, and I know you've been retired quite a long time. How old are you?
Well, I'm not fully retired. I mean, I still work at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital.
Yeah, because you've been around a long time.
I will be 94 in July.
I don't believe, really?
Yes.
Oh my, serious?
I'll be 94 in July.
Oh my, that's amazing, because I thought you were in your
touch wood, that is.
That's okay. Like, the thing is, a lot of it, because I do everything I tell people to do, but I think after what you've just told us all about fish and the brain and how important it is, you obviously do and eat your own work, and then here I can't believe it. Like, that's like it's like 15 years more than I was expecting you to say.
Yeah. Okay, let me just end by saying something that we haven't actually covered, and that is that the extent to which the brain has been shrinking. That in The period of 28,000 to 32,000 years ago. Records of cranial capacity range from 1,500 cc's to 1,700 cc's, 1,700. The present cranial capacity on average is 1,336. This is the most serious issue. People will say, oh, the brain's more concentrated. This is rubbish.
No.
You have escalating mental income. You have declining IQ associated with this shrinking brain. This is a bigger threat to the children of our children, for whom we have responsibility of leaving a planet fit for them to survive. We are not accepting this responsibility because we're doing nothing to support brain health. And it's time we started.
Yes, thank you very much. So on that, I'll just leave it. And I just want to thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate everything that you've said. And I think people will take note, and I hope they buy and read your book.
So do I.
Yes. and I hope
our book, because David Marsh was.
Oh yes, poor old David Marsh. Yes, I forgot,
Yeah.
because I think I gave him all the credit. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I hope I can do it again at some point. I'm sure you'll still be around when you're 100. So
I don't know about that. I'm not counting my chickens.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Every day is happy.
Yes. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to work with me, I have a monthly coaching group where we have live Zooms and open discussion, and there are plenty of people more intelligent than I am in the group, so you'll learn a lot. I also have several courses, including my Mighty Minerals course, which now has 3 bonus modules on food, on additional nutrition for gut problems, nervous system problems, and also a dive into other uses of minerals such as cell salts. You can now join the channel so I can get more guests on and more content out. And also the members, I will make sure that I get to your comments as quickly as possible and give you a good reply. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.